Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. We come to the end of another trying week, one in which we saw more hostages released from their confinement in Gaza, in which we had an interesting case from the DC Circuit, in which we also saw George Santos get the boot. He will be outside the halls of Congress from now on, and where we saw an interesting debate of sorts between two people who are not going to be president of the United States, at least not anytime soon. Gavin Newsom, and of course, Ron DeSantis. So let's go through some of the events of the week. First of all, we saw a series of heart-rending, heartwarming in many ways, scenes in which women and children who had been kidnapped, imprisoned, held in darkness in Gaza were returned to their families. And we cannot but help be thrilled for their families and for them. But I fear the media is portraying this in a very incorrect light. They tend to stress that the hostages look good, that they don't appear to be physically diminished or physically injured, but that's not the case. Slowly, we're getting an account of what happened to them. We have stories that children were forced to view the video of the massacre on October 6th. That is mental torture. We're told that children had their legs burned with the exhaust from motorcycles in order to identify them should they escape somehow. We're told that they were given the most minimal amount of food, not sufficient to sustain adults or children. Some children lost 15% of their body weight, which is enormous. They, of course, were kept in darkness. Many of them were denied medical care. One elderly hostage came home really at death's door. Thank goodness she got appropriate medical attention. There was another woman who was operated on for an injury by a veterinarian because apparently all those doctors who we keep hearing from the hospitals couldn't make it to render medical care. So much for taking them to a proper medical facility in order to care for them. So what do we see here? There are words to describe this: torture, inhumane treatment, cruelty. These are defined by international law, and they are sanctioned by international law. These are war crimes. These are atrocities. So the notion that we should somehow credit Hamas from stealing children, women, men from their families, kidnapping them, holding them in darkness, and subjecting them to this type of treatment, that we should somehow recognize that, wow, they're not so bad, or they really cared for the hostages, or it could have been worse. This is moral madness. This is utterly unacceptable. This is heinous behavior, and we don't hear very much, do we, from the crowd who is shouting from the river to the sea, and who is making excuses for the uprising by Hamas. We don't hear a lot about that. Just like we don't hear a lot about now what is coming out about the terrible sexual violence against women on October 7. We now have dozens of absolutely horrifying accounts of torture, mutilation, rape so violent that some women bled to death, others had their bones broken. And what have we heard from the international community? Silence. It wasn't until the last couple of days, 7 weeks after the ordeal began, that we heard anything from the UN that recognized that this was an atrocity that Hamas had perpetrated on Israeli women. We have plenty of evidence. We have first responders. We have people at the morgue. We have eyewitness accounts of people who observed mass rape at the music festival. There is no shortage of evidence. What there is a shortage of outrage. What there is a international consensus almost. I hate to say it, but it's more a consensus than we would like to believe, that somehow Israel's outrages, Israel's horrible experiences, Israel's victimization gets lesser attention than the pictures we now see of the innocent Palestinians. Again, this is moral madness. One's appreciation for the suffering of one group does not diminish the suffering of another. And one doesn't excuse conduct simply because people on that side have suffered as well. It is monumentally horrifying to see the absence of moral censure, the absence of moral outrage from groups that posit themselves as women's rights activists, from groups that posit themselves as human rights activists. This is shameful and it needs to end. And hopefully, I've written about it. There is a magnificent piece. We'll put in the notes for this piece from Slate, from a group of women, many of them attorneys, many of them prosecutors, detailing this episode. And we need to pay attention. We need to maintain our moral bearings so that we don't excuse the inexcusable. Now, there were other developments in the Israel story. The truce that allowed, or the temporary pause that allowed the exchange of hostages in Gaza for prisoners from Israeli prisons has run its course. The war has restarted. And it has restarted with a very interesting admonition from the United States. The President and Secretary of State Blinken have been increasingly tough-minded in public toward Israel and their obligation to avoid civilian casualties. We've been led to believe that this was discussed repeatedly in private. What we're seeing is increasingly public admonitions and some indication that the Israelis have agreed, some indication that they're now putting out maps for areas in which civilians can be safe from the military engagements that will now continue into the South. And as Secretary Blinken said the other day, the South is a very treacherous place right now. If you recall, we had hundreds of thousands of people from the northern part of the Gaza Strip move down there to get out of the way of the fighting. So now we have a surplus of refugees who are looking for food, looking for shelter, who are very vulnerable. And what Blinken has said is you cannot fight the war in the South the way you did in the North with mass casualties. The administration has been clear that Israel has every right to defend itself. It has rejected this notion that it should stop before Hamas is completely destroyed, because that would simply be setting Israel up for the next war, and it would be preventing any further resolution of the Palestinian conflict. But at the same time, they've been very clear and increasingly emphatic about Israel's obligations, not only to make sure that aid has gotten in, but that they target in a way that hopes to minimize casualties. Now, I will say, this is a very hard thing to do and a very easy thing to say. It's very easy to say, just target the terrorists. But of course, we know how difficult that is when they're embedded in schools, in nurseries, in hospitals. How exactly do they go about doing this? How do they distinguish? How do they minimize the casualties? These are real decisions that commanders on the ground have to make at the same time that they're looking after the welfare of their own troops. So this is not an easy formula, and Israel is continually held to a much higher standard, frankly, than other powers. But that's the way of the world, and Israel will try to have to balance these two objectives. On one hand, eliminating Hamas, and on the other hand, trying to demonstrate their goodwill and good faith in sparing the Palestinian people who are victims as well. Let's go back to the United States for a bit. We did see George Santos voted out of Congress overwhelmingly with, I think, 2 no votes from the Democrats and about half and half from the Republicans, and he is gone. There's an argument to be made that why him? After all, there are people sitting in Congress who tried to collaborate with Donald Trump and overthrow the election of 2020. They're traitors. They shouldn't be there either. But of course, they're not going to be voted out. What did George Santos do that was so terrible? He became a laughingstock. His egregious lying, his ridiculous expenses on everything from Botox to cosmetics became a laugh line and an embarrassment to Republicans. And they figured he was more trouble than he was worth. He's not a great supporter of Donald Trump. He's not a combatant in the cause in the way someone like Jim Jordan is. He's just a joke and an embarrassment. So, frankly, they were pleased to get rid of him. But, and I will say this, the Democrats will pick up that seat. It's a very Democratic seat. It's very unlikely a Republican can win. And one more vote in Congress is one vote closer to controlling the House after the 2024 election. So the extent to which the shrinking majority shrinks further in the House for the Republicans, I think that's a good thing. And it makes it that much easier for Democrats to take over, hopefully after the next election. Let's also talk about the trials of Donald Trump. And they are varied and confusing, and the issues are multiplying. Well, today, which is Friday that we're recording this, we got a decision from a DC appeals court, not in the criminal case that Jack Smith is running, but rather in the civil case that was brought by members of Congress and some of the police officers, alleging that Donald Trump should be held responsible for violation of the so-called KKK statute, that is denying their civil rights and their ability to vote and to have their votes counted. And that civil case has been proceeding along. Donald Trump, in that case, raised a defense that he's immune, that anything he did as president, he cannot be sued for, he cannot be held accountable. The lower court, the district court, said, no, that's not true. What you were doing had nothing to do with your job as president. The job of president is being president. It's not being a candidate, and it's certainly not attempting to overthrow an election. So forget that defense. That's the decision that went up on appeal. And you had a three-person panel at the DC Circuit, including a couple relatively conservative justices, one in particular, Judge Katsas, and it was unanimous. They said, no, you can be sued. There is no presidential immunity that prevents you from being held accountable for your actions as you try to pursue the presidency and keep the presidency. So this was a very important decision, not only for that civil case, but because that very issue is Trump's probably only last shot in his criminal case involving Jack Smith, where he's going to raise exactly the same defense. I'm completely immune. I can do whatever I want as president, and you cannot convict me. That decision in the DC Circuit Court is now what they call the law of the circuit. In other words, that principle applies not only to that case, but to other cases involving the same people, the same fact pattern. Now, Judge Chutkan, who is the judge in the criminal case involving Donald Trump, that is being brought by Jack Smith, is about to rule on the very same issue, the immunity issue. So one can imagine she is going to heavily rely on the civil case, the civil decision that was just issued. She will nix the immunity defense in the criminal case. That will go up on appeal as well. And that panel of the DC Circuit, in all likelihood, will follow the first panel and say, no, there's no immunity defense. And this is critical because without that, there really is nothing between Donald Trump and that trial date on March 4 in 2024. Yes, he can bring that case up to the Supreme Court. I suspect that without a trial record and without any other intervening information or data, the Supreme Court really is not going to be interested in hearing the case at this stage. And that means it's full force ahead to March, in which, let's face it, Jack Smith has the goods on Donald Trump. He has, I don't want to say a slam dunk case, but an overwhelmingly strong case. He's got a good judge. He's going to have a very wide jury pool of people who are more than willing to listen to the evidence. This may have been the most important development in the 2024 election and in the preservation of democracy yet. Because what needs to happen between now and November of 2024 is a criminal conviction. Every bit of data we see, every poll suggests that even Republicans will break away from Trump in large numbers if he is convicted. And let's face it, some of them may not. Some of them may say, oh, the fix is in, nothing matters, it's all a plot. But some people will. It will be a bridge too far for many people. And if that is the difference, if that is the difference between a close election and a not close election, and certainly if it's a difference between Donald Trump getting reelected and President Biden continuing his presidency, that will be the most monumental decision. That will be the most monumental conviction probably in the history of the United States. Because after all, we're talking about our democracy. There is very little doubt now which road Donald Trump is heading down. And I will also include in the notes for this program a opinion piece by my colleague at the Washington Post, Bob Kagan, who describes really how close we are coming to a dictatorship. When you look at Donald Trump's plans, when you look at the lack of checks and balances that he would have in a second term, when you look at the kind of cronies and toadies he would put into office, we would be heading for a very, very bad outcome. But perhaps there's light now. Perhaps there's a chance to derail him. And let's face it, Donald Trump has his own weaknesses. And there isn't an ready off-ramp for the Republicans. The last thing we'll talk about was that debate on Thursday involving the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, and the governor of Florida, who is, I think, properly described as a very weird character, Ron DeSantis. DeSantis was terrible. He had that nervous, gross little smile. Really, Newsom took him apart, up one down and side and down the other. And it really showed how inept, how unlikable, how unaccomplished DeSantis is. And remember, he was supposed to be the alternative to Trump. He was the guy who was going to save the Republican Party. And he's headed in the wrong direction. He's very likely to get passed by Nikki Haley in the contest for second place. So he is going by the wayside. And the Republicans are now looking at, yes, nominating someone who is very likely to get convicted of a felony. So that is good news. There's much wrong with the world. The horrors coming out of Israel and out of Gaza cannot be viewed with anything other than horror and compassion for those people who are affected. Our political system is very badly hobbled because one of our political parties has abandoned democracy. But let's be optimistic. Let's be thankful for an administration that is handling the war with incredible skill and deftness, for a Secretary of State who is able, I think, more than any other Secretary of State to urge and to cajole Israel into conducting a war in a way that we can find defensible. And we have a president of the United States who is presiding over a very strong economy. Once again, good inflation numbers. Once again, indications that the Federal Reserve may stop its interest rate hikes and therefore allow a full blooming of our economy, by the way, which grew at over 5% in the third quarter, not 4.9% that was originally reported. So plenty to be thankful for. I hope all of you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And if you like this program, please tell your friends, have them listen, have them follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.